Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our masterclass this evening. I'm Dr. Marianne East. Brian, who's our usual host, is out at one of our concerts this evening, so I'm filling in. And I want to welcome Grace Sikorski. She teaches English, creative writing, art history, and gender and sexuality studies at Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold, Maryland. She has her BA, MA, and PhD in English, as well as her MFA in creative writing. And she's currently pursuing her MA in art history and visual culture. She's like me, she wants to go to school all the time. I would
True.
totally, if I could make a living going to school, that's completely what I would do. As a creative writer, she is most interested in fiction, especially surrealism and magical realism. The ghost story holds a special place in her heart, and her most recent writing may be found in Lit Magazine, Serpentine, the Journal of Creative Writing Studies, and Theory and Praxis, Women's and Gender Studies in Community Colleges. So welcome, Grace, and we are excited to learn about how to write a ghost story. So I'm going to turn everything over to you. We'll have time at the end for questions, but if any thoughts come into your mind, you can also put them in the chat and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. So, Grace, it's all yours.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. We have a very small group, and I kind of like that. It's far less intimidating having 20 or 50 people. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you, but I'll be doing a lot of talking as I flip through the slides. And my goal today is to discuss writing ghost stories with the idea that maybe you feel creatively moved to write one yourself. And if you're not in the mood to write one, the next time you read one, you'll approach it with some new vision of what it's actually doing. Um, so let me start the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Can you all see the first slide?
Yes.
Great. Fantastic. Okay. When Brian asked me to teach a class on creative writing with you guys, he wanted to sort of find out what I was most interested in. And at first, we were talking generally about fiction and poetry and drama and sort of the classic forms. But then he asked me, "What do you really like to write?" And I said, "Ghost stories." And he said, "That's brilliant. Let's do a session on that." And I have to tell you, ghost stories have been in my mind since I was a very small child. My mom used to tell me ghost stories before I fell asleep at night. So it was in my childhood, it was in my teenage years, and in my adulthood. And as I learned how to write myself, I definitely turned to that form because it was comfortable and it was interesting. Um, so I want to start with this slide. This is a quotation from Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, and she describes why she wrote that story. She thought of it as a ghost story, which is very interesting. Frankenstein is an animated creature, built out of you know, a used body, basically. It's a reanimated corpse. And so to know that she was thinking about that in terms of ghost story is really interesting to me. And the situation was she was on vacation with Lord Byron in Switzerland. It was a very uncomfortable summer, very wet, very rainy, and they challenged each other to write ghost stories. And that's the foundation of Frankenstein. And I know a lot of friends of mine who are professional writers who do that for each other as well. They sort of dare each other to do certain projects. And so I'm inviting all of you to take up that challenge and maybe think about writing a ghost story of your own. One of the things that comes up very quickly for a lot of people when I teach ghost story writing is they ask, isn't that an old-fashioned story form? Do we really care about that anymore? And the fact of the matter is, ghost stories are everywhere you look. And arguably, every major author has attempted to write a ghost story at one point or another, which I think is fascinating. It's everywhere you look, it's ubiquitous. And I have some theories about that. I think it has something to do with ghost stories being absolutely linked to the human imagination. It's purely imaginary, right? It's what the imagination can do with just the seed of an idea. And most ghost stories are actually retellings of old stories and they're adaptations. So the challenge isn't to invent something completely new, but to do something new with the old stuff. And you don't really get that in a lot of genres, that really deep sense of this being an ancient art that you're participating in. There's also something very psychological about ghost stories, even if you don't believe in ghosts yourself. And I don't think a lot of authors have thought about ghosts as real. They're great material for fiction writing, right? They ask questions about what's coming up to the surface, right? What's resurfacing? What's the scary stuff in our culture? A good ghost story makes people feel something, right? Like when you're sitting around a campfire and you're telling ghost stories as a child, the reason why everyone jumps in alarm when you get to the punchline is because everyone is sharing a certain kind of anticipation of what's coming next, right? So there's a shared value system. It feels like community when you get a good story going and people get it. They're also operating as cautionary tales, right? There's a bit of a thrill when somebody says, "Don't go in there, it's dark," and then they tell you what's in there. They show you what's in there. And uh, some of the early 20th century scholars called it a pleasurable shudder. When you read a really great ghost story, it gives you chills and it makes you feel really uncomfortable. There's a sense of the uncanny, there's a sense of the macabre, sometimes the grotesque, and you're immersed in it. There's a sense of you suspend disbelief, right? You buy into the world that's being built for you and the perspectives that are being given to you. And when it ends, right, after that big moment where everything just explodes into panic and it ends, there's the sense of relief, right? So theoretically, it's interesting the way ghost stories have functioned throughout time. In this class, we're going to talk about several different things, and I might talk quickly through some of this to get around to the last few points, which is how to actually write your own ghost story. But I think it's important to know the history of ghost stories and to know where things come from, like the haunted house, the ghost wearing chains, things like that, have specific histories, which is very interesting. We're going to reflect on why the ghost story is so popular and how people have thought about adapting it to continue that popularity. We'll read specific influential examples along the way, and I'll lead into identifying and defining the characteristics of ghost stories as a genre so that you can think about it not only in the traditional form, but in the more adapted forms that started in the 20th century. And we'll talk about all of the options that you have available to you if you're thinking about writing your own. And don't think of writing, a grand, elaborate saga of a novel. You could write something microfiction. You could write just one scene, or you could just interview a character who's a ghost and have some fun with that as a kind of logic game. So ultimately, we hope that you'll get inspired to write some form of the ghost story on your own. So the history of ghost stories goes all the way back to we don't know, infinity. Uh, what we have as a first text, obviously, is the Epic of Gilgamesh from the 20th century BCE. And there are representations in that text of the underworld, right? Spirits occupying a place, which is by definition ghosting, right? If there's a spirit that's disembodied and it exists in a particular place, that's by definition a ghost. So we know that there are very ancient textual evidences of ghosts. Most of the earlier ones also talk about how to get rid of a ghost, right? So there's material there about exorcism and avoidance and containment, because ghosts were generally looked upon as outside of the ordinary, right? They're breaking the rules. They're coming out of their container. They're supposed to belong in one place. But if we see them or we're aware of them, we're living, then something has gone wrong. And I think that's why ghosts have such a natural place in storytelling, because good storytelling um, establishes a kind of plot line where there's a problem that needs to be solved, or there's something that needs to be set right, or there's an opposition of forces that needs to be worked through. And the tension mounts because something is wrong. Yeah, you don't really have a good story unless you have that kind of tension. So as soon as you introduce a ghost, right? You've got a breach of a boundary, you've got some, disruption of order, and naturally something else has to happen after that, right? So it's an inciting incident that naturally develops into a storyline for a lot of people. If we look at the ancients, all over the globe, there are folk tales and legends and lore about disembodied souls. We might call them ghosts, and they're regarded in many different ways. There are tricksters, there are tormentors, there are spirits that are regarded with reverence as ancestral spirits that teach and guide and mentor. And then there are lost souls who are just wandering. They're aimless. They don't have a purpose. They just manifest, maybe against their own will, maybe because they don't have free will anymore. They just sort of happen like vapor, like sensory impressions. You can hear them, you can smell them, right? And we still have this sense of ghosts being difficult to pin down, right? So they're usually breaking rules in one way or another. Even the rules of physics don't apply to ghosts, which makes their storytelling pretty provocative. And then there's a very long history of um, what will later become cliche, right? These are things that the ancients thought about very seriously. The 11th century BCE Egyptian story, Consum Meb and the Ghost, is about a disrupted grave. So, what happens to a spirit if the sacred space that they're supposed to occupy is destroyed or damaged? They're released, right? And something went wrong, so now it has to be put right. And I think that is quintessentially the plot of the traditional ghost story, right? That a ghost exists in our space because something is wrong and it needs to be set right. Yeah. So that's very ancient. Um, if we look at West Asian cultural representations, we might even look at the Book of Job. And a lot of people don't read it this way, but some scholars do, that Job's story comes from a late Iron Age, late Bronze Age culture, the Canaanite culture, the Edomite culture in West Asia. And that culture did believe in reanimation. We might not think of it in the same terms, but they thought of it as second chances, third chances at the same life. So when we read the book of Job, it's kind of confusing. Like, how does he come back at the end? And he has the same children, he has the same things twice over as a reward for not cursing God. There's a part in Job where he's contemplating what happens when people die and the power that God has. And he actually acknowledges that there's a time when God can bring you back and give you life again. So there's this sense of reanimation. Also in, lore and also Old Testament texts, we have representations of haunts and demons and possessions and spirits that are called back up, like the Witch of Endor, who calls back the prophet Samuel to evoke some kind of prophecy about an upcoming battle and things like that. The third century, the ancient Greeks introduced the idea of a very complex system of the underworld and the dead appearing in their physical form. Like they would wear the same clothes, they would speak with the same voice, they would carry the same weapons, which was unique, very different than what we see earlier. The ancient Romans conceptualized them in the same way, very human, like very sort of palpable kinds of entities. And Plautus is the first person who gives us the haunted house. And later, Pliny the Younger talks about a house that he visited where a ghost was held captive for wrongdoing, and he has to drag chains around, which sounds a little bit like Marley, right? In Scrooge's story. So these ideas about ghosts being captive or chained down or out of place, right? That there's a wrongdoing that has to be put right. That's a very ancient conception of ghosts. And then when we look a little bit further in the history, the tale of Genji includes really explicit kind of gory representations of spirits, Thousand and One Nights, plenty of very exciting, sensational kinds of stories that leave you on the edge of your seat. By the way, as a side note, the 12th century saw the invention of purgatory as a concept, and that really enriched the body of work about ghosts. Because if a ghost is in between places, they might not just be in between places here among the living, but they might also be in between places in the afterlife because of their own wrongdoing, right? So they can come back because of free will, because of atonement, because of forgiveness and salvation in sort of a Christian sense of things, and make good on what they did wrong, right? So that opens up a new storyline. Not to be cynical about it, but that's how it works in the fiction. The medieval ghost stories are really very human. You get people describing waking up in the middle of the night and their old father or grandfather or great grandfather is sitting on the bed telling them what to do to solve a problem in their lives. There's a complex idea about what makes someone's imagination work, right? Are you being visited by demons? Are you inducing it? Are you going mad? Are you falling into hysterics? And mysticism itself was something that people induced, right? People would, oddly enough, uh, starve themselves until they saw visions. Some people would inhale the fumes from rotting fruit to induce visions. And there's also chemical mysticism mixed in here, and really interesting ideas about the medieval mind and what stimulates it, what motivates it. And of course, one of the most important literary achievements of the 14th century is by the Italian poet Dante, and he conceptualizes the Inferno and every aspect of the afterlife as this incredibly complex mapping out of hierarchies and cause and effect. This was your life. This is the consequence in your afterlife. Um, and he wasn't original. I mean, let's face it, most of the people that he wrote about came from history or legend. And his way of describing things was not entirely original, but what was original was recombining it and creating this entire system, this world building of afterlife. Um, and of course, Dante, as the character in the Inferno, is being guided by Virgil, right, the Roman poet. And the Roman poet Virgil in Dante disqualifies all of the ancient ways of knowing gods and says that's one of the reasons I'm down here and I'm able to tour in the Inferno with you. And there are these descriptions of lamentations, of continual purgation, right, of purgatory, um, and penance. Uh, and those ideas about the afterlife definitely change the way people tell stories. Yeah. Hamlet, of course, somewhere around 1600, it was written, right? 1599, 1600. Hamlet's father's ghost, King Hamlet, is one of the most well-known ghosts in literary history. And the way that he describes where he comes from is rarely given a lot of emphasis when the play is taught. But it's the reason why Hamlet doesn't act for 5 excruciatingly long dramatic acts of the play, right? He doesn't just jump at his uncle Claudius and avenge his father's death. Why? His father's ghost comes to him and says, "Kill your uncle because he killed me." And Hamlet does nothing. This is why, because his father's ghost describes where he comes from, and it's not heaven. This is a ghost that's walking out temporarily from what he calls my prison house, right? And he describes it as a place of foul, diseased, um, inflamed pain and punishment for what he has done. So if that kind of ghost comes to you and says, "You know what, do this one more thing for me," and avenge my death by killing one more person on top of everybody else that I've killed in Norway and Sweden and all these other places I've gone to war, you're gonna be like, maybe, maybe not. So Hamlet goes off and tries to prove it, right? I mean, he's a German educated student and he is more in tune with, sort of a Protestant idea, less mysticism, more reality, right? He wants science, he wants proof, he wants logic, and that's Hamlet's mind, right? And Hamlet also thinks that maybe this is a sign of insanity. So that tells you something about the way people thought about ghosts, that they could be misleading you and tempting you into your own damnation. They could be creating mischief just for entertainment value. We've seen that before. Hamlet says, I don't know what you're doing, but if you want me to fall off this cliff to make you laugh, right, that's not what I'm going to do. Um, or they might be sustaining their own wrongdoings. They might come back for revenge. Yeah. So there's something unnatural about Hamlet's ghost. That's the inciting incident for Hamlet. Nothing else would happen in Hamlet without that ghost. And the ghost in stage history is usually presented as the actor dressed up in military costume, right? So this is a warrior ghost. This isn't somebody who's wearing his shroud, right? It's not an unwillful, this is a very highly motivated ghost with his own decisions to make, and he's forcing this plot forward, right? So that's a different kind of story to tell. The Gothic is definitely associated with ghost stories. This is something that evolves in the 18th century into the 19th century. The 19th century starts to make fun of it. But in the 18th century, the idea of the Gothic harkened back to the Middle Ages in certain ways. Like there were certain places that were ancient. Um, uh, Places that seem to be saturated with the blood, sweat, and tears of the ancestors, right? So ancient castles, ancient ruins, ancient graveyards, ancient roads, especially crossroads, the places that have been there for too long so that you don't know how they originated. There's a sort of mystery about them, a sort of unknowing about them. And there was also in the Gothic a real emphasis on the loss of innocence. So the death of a child, or the death of a bride who's still virginal, or the death of a priest, right? There's something in the Gothic that says when things go wrong, they go terribly, terribly wrong, right? And when that happens, the ghosts will definitely have a hand in putting things right, or there needs to be a hero who can charge in and put things right. The onstage ghost, um, in the first part of the 18th century was like King Hamlet's ghost, very overly dressed in very sort of fortified armor or some kind of pageantry outfit, something that said this is an important person, we need to pay attention to their death. Obviously, these people in leadership, their lives meant more than everybody else's, so their tragedy is more magnified because of it. But in the later 18th century, the theater conventions changed, and because the ghosts started having more compelling parts, more lines, and they moved more around the stage, the armor and all those pageantry, that was replaced with a sheet. So it was to invoke an absence of a body, right? So you would actually sheathe the actor, and the actor would sort of float around on stage and sort of impress the audience as disembodied, right? And that becomes a cliche. Kids even now wear sheets to represent the ghost, right? But that's where it comes from. It's a theater convention. Um, and there was also an idea of highly idealized death. Um, like if you think about paintings of Ophelia drowning, they're never grotesque, they're never disgusting, they're never explicit. And that has to do with Gothic aesthetic. So the Gothic might, in our popular imagination, be conjured by sort of an old decrepit castle. But when it comes to what kind of death the Gothic was interested in, it was very picturesque, very idealized, almost impossibly idealized death. And that had to do with the loss of innocence, that even in death, innocence exists. Right. So there's a real crossing over between somebody who's done wrong, who is seeking vengeance, to the death of a virginal bride, right? The sense of loss is different there. Yeah. And everybody thinks about the 19th century as the golden age of the ghost story. And for really good reason. The popular press really took off with ghost stories. They sold well. You could write them in many different ways for many different kinds of readers. You could call on all of the old versions of the story and then give them a little bit of a push in the ironic direction, and people would laugh. There are lots of great things that are happening in the 19th century, and there's also culturally, especially in Germany, in Russia, and I would say especially in England and France, there's a fascination with death, And I don't want to go into the theory behind this, but it's really curious that in England, for example, um, there were places called mourning warehouses. Think Macy's draped out in black. Like they sold everything related to grief. You could walk into a mourning warehouse with a picture, a cameo of the person who just passed away, and they would print invitations to the funeral, right? They would take a lock of somebody's hair and weave jewelry that you could then give to the people who come to the funeral, right? They would actually hire the musicians to go to your funeral, right? They would write your story for the newspapers. They would help you with your investments, your family's investments after they read the will. Like this was a one-stop shopping center for grief. And they were enormous. I mean, huge, like Woolworths, like times 10, huge. They occupied blocks of London. Um, and so the stories that went around during this time, because of the popular press, the availability of it, and that sense of um, uh, almost like the theater involved with it, the theater and the show of grief at this time, lent itself very well for the development of the genre, right? So when you read something like the American Washington Irving story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it's actually acknowledging that there's a fashion about death and dying. And when you tell a ghost story, you're actually playing into that. And you can either accept it and say, this is what I like about this, or you could turn it on its head. And if you really read Washington Irving's story, it's actually making fun of women quite a lot because the primary readership for the popular press stories were women. So women's magazines usually ran ghost stories, women's periodicals of all kinds. So they poke fun at women as too sensible, too in tune with their emotions, too prone to having passionate fits, this sort of thing. Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, does the same thing. And if you read the prologue to the story, it's poking fun at the reader, assuming that the reader is probably going to be a hysterical woman. And women read this stuff, politically incorrect as it was, they really bought into it because it's like going to a good movie with a box of Kleenex. You know what you're getting yourself into. You're buying into it, and there's a sensationalism about it, but it's familiar. You know how it's going to go. It's going to scare the bejesus out of you, and then you're going to tell all of your friends about it, right? It's better than soap operas. It's better than novella in Brazil. You tell people about these things and it sort of propagates. Yeah. It's not that dissimilar from sitting around the campfire and telling ghost stories as a kid, right? You are going to tell that story again later, right? It's a chain that keeps going. Um, Edgar Allan Poe is generally regarded as the master of horror. And in the 19th century, even his contemporaries thought of him that way. And when we read something like The Fall of the House of Usher, it's definitely playing into that sense of hysteria. I mean, I don't know any other story that does as much in conjuring the things that horrify people. And when you just ask that question, what horrifies you? Not what scares you or what terrifies you or, what do you think of as ghosts, but what really horrifies you? There are lots of things that come to mind. And for Poe, things like going insane, right? Losing your wits, or having every single one of your senses so heightened that you can't even bear to be in the real world, right? That you want to secret yourself away, that your own twin has died, that you have to bury her, that your family requires that she be buried in the house where you live, right? And that you keep hearing her. You keep hearing her and smelling her and sensing her in the house, even after you've done all of these things. She won't leave you alone. The suggestion that the family of Usher has one branch to it. This is something that happens to come up in the early pages. There's a sense of inbreeding being horrifying, that there's something wrong with this family, and the idea that maybe the brother actually killed the sister, that he's actually lost his mind. He won't own up to it. Nothing else can explain what's going on at the end. And I've given you the paragraph that is close to the end here. Um, it says, as if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed, that's Usher. They're slowly back. Upon the instant, their ponderous and ebony jaws, like the walls, part. It was the work of the rushing gust, but then without those doors there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, then with a low moaning cry fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor, a corpse and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. And it's just delicious. It's just chock full of every horror you can imagine. And this is the stuff of dreams, right? I mean, everybody I know has had some form of a terrifying dream. It usually starts in childhood. For some reason, we know how to populate dreams with terror. Poe knew how to do that in a conscious way when he was writing his stories. And The Fall of the House of Usher is just a classic. Now, Sigmund Freud, let's bring him up because he actually improved the genre in a very particular way by bringing to the forefront, in a conscious way, the idea that what we fear and what we're horrified by has a very thin line between it and what we deeply, deeply desire. Right? So his ideas about psychology are much more complicated than I can possibly represent them here. But what he said about being ghosted or being sort of haunted by things, he said a thing which has not been understood inevitably reappears. So if it's unexamined, or if it's not acknowledged, or if people haven't really formulated a conceptualization of it yet, it stands in the realm of mystery, then it will keep coming up over and over and over again in our minds because that's what we do as human creatures, right? He said, like an unlaid ghost, it cannot rest until the mystery has been resolved and the spell broken, right? In another text, he talks about the uncanny, something that you just can't lock in on, right? It's not something that you're familiar with. It's not in your home, right? It's not in your space usually. And these things have a lot to do with repression, right? So it's not just the mystery of the things that we don't understand, but the things that we subconsciously repress. That's what comes up to the surface in ghost stories, which is fascinating when you think about it. Well, you could read back to the ancient Greek or Roman or back to Gilgamesh to figure this out. But the idea that something is pushed underground or pushed into the walls of Usher, or not spoken about, or something like that, that it comes up to the surface, that is the driving sort of engine behind a ghost story, classically speaking. So the questions that you might ask yourself as a writer to get inspiration: what do we repress? What are the urges, the memories, the ideas, the instincts that we repress, that we try to control? And the ghost breaks up into the surface, right? It's like the ultimate Freudian slip, right? It's going to come up, right, in one way or another. What causes shame? What would we prefer to keep secret, right? What is primitive or in the past that we would rather not acknowledge? Who or what is the other, the thing that we separate ourselves from in order to guarantee our sense of identity? What is beyond language, right? What do we deny? We say no to. What do we fear because we don't want it to touch us and endanger us? And not too far from that is, what do we desire? But we won't admit it, right? It now returns, it repeats, and it haunts us. So Woody Allen would love this, right? Woody Allen would just be excited about this. He would do this thing that he does like this. Do you remember the Woody Allen story? I think it's Oedipus Rex, but he spells Rex Wrecks. It's a story from the 60s, I think. It's one of his earlier ones, and he has a fantasy about his mother, who is a very stereotypical, nagging Jewish mother who embarrasses him at every turn, especially when he brings a girl home. He He has a fantasy of her just disappearing, and one day she actually does. She just disappears. But the horrifying thing is she returns in a larger than life voice over Manhattan, and now she's telling everybody in New York City all of his worst shameful things, like he used to wet his bed when he was a child and all this kind of stuff. Um, this is definitely Freudian, right? I mean, Woody Allen was definitely interested in that. But there are other things to be afraid of or to deny or to be ashamed of. And when we look at Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which is like Dante's Inferno, one of those canonical works when we talk about ghost stories, A Christmas Carol isn't just a story of horrors, and it's not just a comedy, although it's both of those things as well. There's an awful lot of comedy in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. It starts with, I'll read you the opening paragraph. It makes me giggle every time. He says, Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. He's sort of banging our heads against it, right? This is going to be a ghost story, guys. And he was dead as a doornail. Don't doubt that. Even though he's going to come back in a few pages, right? So there's a lot of comedy there. But when we talk about that Freudian sense of the repressed and the guilt and the shame that comes up to the surface, Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol very explicitly as a political statement against recent British laws at the time that were put in place to basically torment the poor in England. They were called the Treadmill and Poor Acts, I think, the Treadmill and Poor Laws, which said if you were poor and you couldn't pay your bills, you either worked in the houses that were created as sort of, forced labor, um, or you went into jail, right? And if you went into jail, the popular form of punishment was to put people on treadmills and to harness the energy created by the treadmills to fire the engine to the Industrial Revolution. So it was creating a subclass of humanity, right? Below slavery. You can imagine this being absolute torment, right? Dante would say, this is out of my inferno. This is impossible. And Dickens gets his teeth into that and creates Scrooge as the personification of that idea. And then Marley comes back, chained up, carrying his money boxes and making all kinds of fuss, trying to make Scrooge atone for his sins and repent. And he won't do it until he visits upon the ghosts of Christmas past, right? And then by the end of the story, ironically, because he's going into the future, he's a past spirit. So he's a ghost, right? So there's a lot of technique involved with Dickens. It's comedy, it's morality play, it's political diatribe, and it includes the most brilliant turns of phrase. Like when Scrooge sees Marley at first, he says, "You, I don't believe in you." He says, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." And he storms off into his bed and covers his head. Um, I love Dickens so much. There's so much space in ghost stories to be comedic, right? Because it stands in a high contrast to the drama of death and dying. Um, and that sense of irreverence can't be found very far from Oscar Wilde. You guys have read Oscar Wilde before, probably. The Canterville Ghost was made into a movie in 46 with little Margaret O'Brien. Do you remember her? Is that her name? Yes, Margaret O'Brien, right? Um, and the very old-fashioned way of telling a ghost story is there's a stain in the carpet that won't be washed out, right? And there's a sign there that the ghost is still there, right? Because the blood is still there. There's a stain on the family history, right? Something went wrong, somebody was killed in the wrong way, something like that, or there was a suicide. And Oscar Wilde takes that and makes the ghost come back as sort of a fop of a late medieval, early Renaissance aristocrat who wants the girl, the little girl, to put his death to rights. So he takes up sort of the traditional elements, but he tweaks them a little bit and makes them very, very funny. And the funniest part is when the stain actually does come out. Right. So there's room to play with these things and make them comedic. In the 40s, unusually popular was the ghost story motif in movies. Abbott and Costello had an old movie, The Time of Their Lives, in which two ghosts are inadvertently confined to Danbury Acres, I think is what it was called. They're doomed to linger there until proof of their innocence is brought to light. And the only thing that they're guilty of is being at the wrong place at the wrong time. The Ghost and Mrs. Muir was turned into a TV show, I think, in the 70s. But in its original form, it's kind of a racy romance of star-crossed lovers. There's a scene where he's the ghost and she's the living person, and she buys his old house, so he haunts her. And there's a scene very early on in their relationship where she's going into bed, like she's in her nightgown, she goes into bed, and she turns the lights out, and in the dark he gives her a compliment about her figure, which implies that he's been watching her all along. you know. And at the end, they walk off into the sunset together because she has died as an old woman, but she's restored as a young woman in her afterlife, and they walk off into the sunset together. So it's a romance. And then you have Hitchcock's Rebecca, which is based on the novel, which veers into psychological thriller because the new um, De Winter, the new Mrs. De Winter, is being spooked by all of the remnants of the first Mrs. De Winter, who died mysteriously off a cliff. Where are they, in Dover? Something like that. Not Can't remember where exactly that takes place, but Hitchcock, of course, will heighten that with all kinds of dramatic music and lighting and cuts of cinematic effect. Right. So the 20th century cinematic ghost really plays around with the elements of the technology. What can be seen, what can be suggested by the right kind of phrase of music or the right shadows in a room, um, and so forth. Um, and it does get kind of racy. You have something like Blithe Spirit, which was recently remade. It was originally a Noel Coward play in the 1920s. And Elvira Condamine, which I love. That's a great name for a racy character. She's one of those ironic ghosts who has a lot of life in her. She has more life in her than the living people. And that's a type of ghost that comes up. And she says to her husband, who conjured her during a seance, "Well, I really am a little hurt. You call me back, and at a great inconvenience I came, and you've been thoroughly churlish ever since I arrived." So she's like, "You're being rude. I came all this way. Why aren't you being nice to me?" Topper is one of my personal favorites. It's also based on a novel from the 20s, and it's about a pair of married people, a man and a woman, and they are racy and fast and freewheeling. They're very rich. They have not a care in the world, but they get into a car accident and die. In the movie version, Cary Grant plays one of the leads. Um, and he doesn't have the same role as his wife. His wife is trying to find a way for them to move on, right? Because they're stuck, they're not moving on. So she decides to corrupt a very stodgy, old-fashioned kind of banker who is a friend of theirs. And the banker buys their car and starts acting like her husband does, and gets into all kinds of trouble. At the end, we know that the husband and wife have moved on because they sort of disappear. And Topper goes in, that's the living guy's name. He goes to his wife, and she's been wanting to be more racy. She's been wanting something to spice up their lives. And there's this moment where they're looking at a piece of lingerie together. So ghosting in the 1940s was, in some ways, a space in the movies where you could suggest things, maybe to defy the Hays Code, maybe to suggest this isn't human behavior, this is ghost behavior, so it sort of passes through the code review board. I don't know what was going on behind closed doors, but they certainly took advantage of it, right? And then you have something in the 1950s like Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which is a neo-Gothic novel with a lot of lesbian subtext. So what's coming up to the surface is in the mind of the reader. And I think this is an interesting part of ghostwriting in the 20th century. So, whereas the Romantics and the Gothics wanted all of it to be very sensationally represented, like you could get pages and pages describing the House of Usher, right? Pages and pages and pages. Um, in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, she sort of invokes what's going on instead. And there's a lot of suggestion about what's horrifying, but you don't really get it presented in an explicit way. For instance, there's one scene where two women are in a dark room and they're talking to each other and they don't know what's going on, really. There's a lot of mystery. And one of them, her point of view, she's holding somebody's hand because she's afraid. And then she realizes when the lights come back on that nobody else is with her. And the line just stands on its own. God, whose hand was I holding? You know, you don't get any action. The lights are off. It's only in her private mind that she's experiencing this, right? So that power of suggestion opens up a door for anything and everything that you want to suggest the characters might be experiencing. What are they afraid of? What do they most desire? Really come together in Shirley Jackson's novel. She's never going to tell you what the characters are afraid of or what they desire, but you're going to sense it. There's something very disturbing about it. And that's a sign of the times, right? In the 1950s, this is the generation that saw, the Senate hearings with McCarthy. Anything that was outside of the norm was to be policed and controlled and contained, if not punished, and alienated, right? And so Shirley Jackson's encoding of lesbian subtext is perfect for that generation. It speaks to the mind of that generation, right? There's an interesting book. Sorry that it's so sort of drizzly on the screen. It's called The Apparitional Lesbian, and it makes the case that a great deal of sensational literature sublimates same-sex desire. Um, it doesn't have to be intentional. It's not about intention. It's the fact that in certain places at certain times, same-sex desire, like incest, like heresy, like all kinds of vices, uh, is generally regarded as something to be repressed. So it's part of that system of repression that will come up to the surface. So interestingly, it makes a very interesting case that the lesbian has been a ghost in literature for longer than people usually recognize for that reason. Like it's invoked, it's suggested. Um, and then you have, more in the 21st century vein, sort of a very proud declaration of identity in certain ghost stories. Like what happens when you factor in different differences, right? So what if you have a non-binary ghost? What if you have a transgender? Here's an interesting question that I've seen turned over in the internet, when people talk about ghost story writing. If a ghost dies, do they retain the body that they died with? Right? Is that the identity that you see, right? And so if this person transitioned into a different gender identity or sex identity, then do they have the body that they had at the time of death? Or is there some kind of a haunting of their prior life inside of their haunting? Like there's sort of a recessed version of this. Um, And it's very evocative when people tell their stories about transitioning because, for instance, if somebody changes their name, they talk about their dead name, the name that they put to bed, right? The name that they don't have anymore. When they change their name, that's called a dead name. And there are lots of other sort of narrative tropes that work really well. Um, in the 20th century and the 21st century, ghost story writing hit the big screen. It was Hollywood, blockbuster material. Field of Dreams is highly nostalgic. Ghostbusters is, Saturday Night Live on steroids. Poltergeist is terror, with little Sue Ann falling into a kind of portal into the afterlife and her parents can't get her back. It's the worst kind of child abduction story I've ever encountered. And then you have Kubrick's direction of The Shining, where Shelley Duvall nearly lost her mind in truth with acting, for Kubrick. And all of that tells you that this genre is not dead. It's just that people are creating it in different ways, right? They're adaptations. I think one of the most interesting things that happens in the 20th century is ironic twists at the end of these stories. And here's three examples. The two that really resonate for me are The Sixth Sense and The Others. In The Sixth Sense, Bruce Willis plays a character. I think he's the father of a son. Uh, he's the doctor, I think. The irony is the doctor doesn't know um, that the boy is seeing him because he himself is dead, right? That doesn't come out to the audience either until fairly late. And in The Others, starring Nicole Kidman, there are two children who don't know that they've been killed, but killed by whom? Their own mother. And for what reason? Because during World War II, she was so terrified by the propaganda of invasion that when she hears a bump in the night, she grabs the shotgun and does what she would never in her wildest dreams think of doing. And it's so it becomes much more um, explicit and it reaches into the corners of terror, right? Of horror, the things that people will do. And sometimes there are things for kids that are truly just on the kids level, right? For entertainment value, like Casper the Friendly Ghost, I think, which originated in the 40s, becomes popular again in the 1990s. Scooby-Doo, which was really very fashionable in the late 60s, becomes fashionable again in the 90s. Harry Potter, the character right in the center of your screen, is Moaning Myrtle. Moaning Myrtle is an interesting character because she lives in the girls' bathroom at Hogwarts in Harry Potter's world, and she's a character of absolute excess. She runs the water all the time. She floods out the bathrooms. She splashes people with water and urine and all kinds of things. And I think that speaks to the anxiety about little girls growing up into women, right? And the things that happen in the bathrooms that are so mysterious to the boys. Pac-Man uses ghosts as sort of target practice. They're to be hunted like foxes. They're sort of, they can be eaten up. And even Dr. Seuss, the original Dr. Seuss, wrote a book about a pair of haunted pants to teach children not to be afraid of things because the critter that he describes in the pair of pants actually become friends. Um, so that all is to say that the history of the ghost story is really extensive and complicated, right? And um, let's see, what time is it? It's 8:25. Good, we've got a good time. So let's transition now from talking about the history and all of those samples to specific craft choices that people make. So writers, what are they thinking about when they write these things these days? There are several different things that seem to be a matter of deliberate choice, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about options here. So there are formal choices that you can make, what kind of genre you want to write inside of, comedy, tragedy, but more subtle than that. What settings you want to explore, which points of view work best, um, what characters you can develop, how to narrate a story, what sorts of plot arcs you can follow through on, and how to stylize the language itself. Okay, so for genre, if you're writing fiction, there's a full range of types of fiction that you could write, and you can cross over into other kinds of genres that might not feel natural. Um, Fiction these days looks in many different forms. It can be long or short, and it can take many different forms. It can be in the form of, let's say, a series of love letters. Fiction can take that form. Fiction can take the form of a public speech. Fiction can take the form of a confession, right? So fiction isn't just a story in the realistic mode where you tell a story about what happened. You can actually show it in different ways. The form of the document itself can be in a different form. Drama can be written for stage or TV or film. It can be written for animation. It can be written in many different media and poetry or lyrics, right? I always put those two things together because originally poetry was lyrical, and I don't know if it's lost that flavor. And those of you who are in the room who are musical would probably agree with me that there's plenty of opportunity to put music to words and words to music and give it new meaning. So thinking about language as an accompaniment to the sound of music, I think is an interesting one. You know, there are plenty of poets who deliberately set their poems to musical meter and understand that volume shifts and intonation and phrasing is borrowed from music, right? Their understanding of music comes first, that's prior. So poetry is an interesting natural for you guys who are musical. Um, I'm going to go past that. Let's focus a little bit on setting. There's a lot of power in where your ghost story will be set. So here's an example from Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in '88. Uh, I think it's her masterpiece. Um, it's such a well-shaped novel. It was so well received. And the novel starts this way. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way, but by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Shugs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old, as soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it. That was the signal for Bugler. As soon as two tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettleful of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor, soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months, even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once the moment the house committed what for him was the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. And I had a professor once tell me when you're writing fiction, the first paragraph makes a contract with the reader. It tells the reader, I'm promising you something. And there's so much promise in this opening paragraph. All the things that we're about to learn about, right? Who was the baby? Where is 124? It sounds like a place, a house, right? Who are Setha and her daughter Denver? Why didn't they leave with the boys? How did grandmother Baby Shugs die? How does a baby ghost break a mirror, right? Or spill chickpeas on the floor? Or was that because the people were so terrified that their hands were shaking, right? Why was it that sometimes the baby ghost wasn't so upset to do these things? Weeks and months, right? So there's so much here. The place of it, it's in Ohio, and it's 1873, and the narrative, oh, it's so tragic. Setha was a runaway slave. When she ran, she was pregnant. Denver had already been born. She was like 2 years old, right? So Setha has other children, and she's trying to get to them. She runs from her slave master. Her feet are bleeding. Her body is broken. She has no more strength to go on. And when she finally gets to her family, there are men chasing her. And to escape slavery, her mind thinks the only way out is death, right? And the thing that she kills first is her baby. And that's the baby that's in this house. And that's the baby that keeps coming back to haunt the mother and the daughter and everybody who passes through. And Setha names the baby Beloved when she buries the baby. And she is surprised when 17 years later, I think, a woman comes out of the water and claims to be beloved. She's the right age, she looks the right way, and she knows things about Setha, like she says to Setha, tell me the story about your earrings. And that's what the baby like was holding on to when it died. So there's this eeriness, but the novel is about the broken trauma history of people who were born into slavery or people who were of that generation who would have known about it. So it's a book about history, and it's personifying it in Beloved. It's pure poetry when you read this book. Something about point of view. So in Beloved, the point of view changes. Sometimes Beloved actually tells you part of the story, and what she describes sounds like she was in a slave ship. And it goes back to Setha, it goes to Denver, it goes to a bunch of other people. And that shifting point of view, it's very Faulknerian, right? Here's a couple of pages out of Lincoln in the Bardo, which won the Man Booker Prize several years, a couple of years ago, not too long ago. And it tells the story of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and his experience of losing his young son and the difficulty of losing his own son. And the cast of characters who narrate it are the people in the graveyard, the souls in the graveyard. And it doesn't make sense most of the time. It's really fragmented, very postmodern, it's very impressionistic, it's very splashy. If this were a painting, it would not have line drawing behind layers of paint. It wouldn't be realistic. There's something about this that is cacophonous, it's very discordant. The voices don't agree, they don't speak to each other. It's it's like walking into a crowd, right? It's like walking into a crowd. So that's one option. Other options for point of view that we've already talked about, a ghost that doesn't know it's a ghost, right? A ghost that is alone versus a ghost that's in company with other people. A ghost that can tell its own story because it knows it versus a ghost that doesn't even know how it died. A ghost that is filled with motivation and free will, even to the point of revenge, versus a ghost that's just wandering around, not knowing where to go or what to do, feeling pretty pitiable. Lots and lots of options about point of view. The point of view can also be thought of in terms of the person, right? Is it first person point of view? Is it the person who sees the ghost telling you the story, full of dread, full of fear, not knowing, right? Is it a limited, omniscient first person point of view because they know a little bit about it, or maybe they're finding clues about it as they go forward? Um, is it something more like from the point of view of the ghost himself or herself or their selves? Is the point of view omniscient because it's told from the point of view of death, right? The book thief is told from the point of view of death, and it's a very haunting narrative. Right? So point of view is really essential. You have to do that deliberately. Character, oh my gosh, character, you could create anybody you want, right? A ghost doesn't have to be somebody who is upper class and aristocratic. It doesn't have to be a young bride dressed in white. It doesn't have to be one of those sort of cliche characters. And Amy Tan created a character for Saving Fish from Drowning that I absolutely adore. This person is a travel agent and she doesn't know how she died, but she went to her own funeral and she follows the last group of people that she scheduled a tour for in Myanmar, and she helps bring them back home. Um, and one of the opening pages says, when the funeral finally happened on December 11th, it was nearly 10 days after I died, and without preservation, I would have been compost. Nonetheless, many came to see and mourn me. A modest guess would be, 800, though I'm not strictly counting. To begin, there was my Yorkshire Terrier, Puccini, in the front row, prostrate, head over paws, sighing through the numerous eulogies. Beside him was my good friend Harry Bailey, giving him the occasional piece of desiccated liver. Harry had offered to adopt Puccini, and my executor readily agreed since Harry is, as everyone knows, that famous British dog trainer on television. Perhaps you've seen his show, The Fido Files. #1 ratings and many, many Emmy Awards. Lucky little Puccini. By the end of the paragraph, you're like, what are we talking about? Like, where did you take me there? Like at the beginning, we're at your funeral, and then at the end, we're thinking what a lucky little dog he is, right? And it's just filled with that kind of comedy. That character is so good. It's very Dickensian. Um, and when you narrate a ghost story, you're at liberty to do whatever you want. Ghost stories are fabulous that way because it's always invention. You can't do it wrong. And Neil Gaiman wrote a novel called The Graveyard Book, which is almost always advertised as a children's book, but it is really terrifying. The story is a family is killed at the very beginning, all but one child. The child that escapes is a very small baby, and the baby goes crawling up the hill away from the house. He's not injured, he's just that young. Right? He crawls away from the house and he hides himself in a graveyard, and the spirits that are there shelter him so that the evildoer doesn't find him. And this is the opening. There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. The knife had a handle of polished black bone and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to that house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. Yikes. I think that really would affect the child imagination, but I think it affects my child imagination in my own head. And last thing, style. Um, Style has to do with the way that you actually create the text, right? So when we look at something like Stephen King's Jerusalem's Lot, he writes it as a series of letters, and the person who's writing the letters is getting more and more freaked out. And you're with them because you're receiving these letters, right? You're in the position of receiving them as his friend. It's set in 1850, so we're going back in time. Every time it starts, Dear Bones, and the name Bones enough is very appropriate. And it just luxuriates in the genre. How good it was to step into the cold, drafty hall here in Chapin-Waite. Every bone is in an ache from that abominable coach in need of instant relief from my distended bladder, and to see a letter addressed in your own inimitable scrawl propped on the obscene little cherry wood table beside the door, be assured that I set to deciphering it as soon as the needs of the body were attended to in a coldly ornate downstairs bathroom where I could see my breath rising before my eyes. It's just having so much fun. It's like, okay, if this genre tells me that I have to describe everything, I'm going to describe the air in the bathroom where I'm relieving myself. Right? But it pretends to be this very sort of almost Bram Stoker-esque kind of gothic story. So this is the last slide. It's just a rant about all the things that you can play around with. Ghost stories are a matter of play. At this point in the genre's development, everything and anything is up to you, and everything and anything can work. So interview a ghost. I give that assignment to my students sometimes, like choose a character and interview the character, and interview a ghost. Find out their name, their age, their height, their origin, their beliefs, their fears, their motives, desires, experiences. How do they speak? What's their voice, accent? What's their attitude? What are they able to do? What are they disabled to do? What's their race, ethnicity, nationality, ideology, genealogy? Like, how would they have voted in the current election year, right? That kind of thing. Who are their friends? Who are their foes? What do they look like? What's their appearance? What are their powers? What do they know about? And what are they ignorant about? What insights do they have? What clothing or jewelry or body modifications distinguish them, right? What props do they carry around or interact with? Do they have sexual orientation, gender identity, religion? Do they reflect or defy dominant attitudes and expectations? Are they returning from the dead, or did they never leave? What's their socioeconomic class? Do they have a military history? Are they artistic? Are they talented in any way? Are they quiet or loud? Are they motivated to do something, or they are adrift? Are they embodied so that you can see them, or are they disembodied? Are they just sort of sensory impressions? Do they communicate in other ways? Are they sending you emails? Are they calling you on the phone? How should their story be told, right? Get to know them. Try to figure out, if you really did imagine that someone told you their story, how would you then transmit it to a reader? And then just have fun with it. Mix it up. Write your own story. So I know that we're close to like 15 minutes left. Is that right? About 15, 16 minutes left. I'll stop sharing now so that we're not in PowerPoint mode, and then we can just do Q&A.
That was a lot. So, because I'm not a writer at all. And I quite frankly don't really like ghost stories that much either.
Oh
Because I don't like to be scared.
no. No.
I have siblings that they would go after, the very scary movies or the very scary books, but so that's why I signed up and joined you, because I really wanted to hear, about it more. And I'm really enjoying what you have presented so far. So that's really wonderful. There was and I'm kind of interested in starting to write something. I'm not sure what, but so I'm looking for inspiration. So I appreciate what you brought to me tonight.
Yeah. Ghosts are great characters because they let you do whatever you want to do with them. And it's rare to find that. You know, they're very malleable. You can change them into whatever you need them to be for your story. And they don't even have to be there. You might just have a character who believes in them. So it's interesting how they can function that way. Thanks for that.
So I guess one question would be that if I was going to start writing a ghost story, or quite frankly any story, is there like a question or something, to to get started? So I appreciate all the different things that you spoke about with genre and setting and point of view and all of those things. But in terms of just, someone that doesn't write at all, are there some prompts that might help, whether it's a story or a poem for that matter,
Mhm.
to get started?
There are lots of different ways to get started. Um, I always like the idea of interviewing a character. It doesn't have to be in ghost story mode, but interviewing a character and literally imagining them telling you something about themselves. A lot of professional authors describe it as sort of a visitation. When they start to think about a character, they really start to think about that person talking to them. And they think about what would happen if I handed them a tennis racket. What would happen if I invited them to dinner with my mother-in-law, you know? And they start playing around with this because it's fun. It's sort of a mental puzzle. Um, if character isn't something that works for you, think about plot in terms of an inciting incident that disrupts the ordinary everyday. So think about The Wizard of Oz. Do you remember that the way the novel starts? It's a little bit different from the movie, but um, you get this very sort of flatlined image of Kansas, and nothing is changing. And I think the movie does a good job of representing that much, right? None of the characters are changing. Everything's been the way it is all the time. There's a routine about the farm, and everything's the same. And then Gulch comes and says that the dog is causing trouble, right? And she becomes a problem, right, that they have to solve. It's a small problem until, Dorothy is transported and then there's a much bigger problem. She can't get home. But that's the inciting incident. So if you imagine a world and the way things are ordinarily, and the system can be as small as a room in a house, like the room is what it's always been, right? Or it can be a house, or it could be a family, or the way you always do Christmas, or whatever, right? Um, Now put something else in there that's going to disrupt it and stir things up, right? Or make somebody go away from where they're used to being, right? Send them on a journey. Or introduce something that is an adversary to them, that challenges them to do something that they would never do. I mean, never, ever, ever in their lives do. Now, can you take that person and bring them all the way to the end of the story so that they've been changed somehow? Right? And when they come back into the world, it's no longer the way it used to be. So the inciting incident doesn't change the system. It's the return back into the system after they've been on their journey. And the journey can be, for Virginia Woolf, it's going out to buy flowers, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be monumental, but the journey always starts with an inciting incident that challenges the system. Somebody has to respond to the challenge, which usually means that they travel or move or do something active, And when they come back in, either they've changed, so the way they see the system is different, or the system itself has to change to accommodate them. Right? Yeah. So that's another way of thinking about it in terms of plot arc. And another way of thinking about it is in terms of the stakes. What's at risk? What might be lost and what might be won or earned, right? Um, so if a character wants something badly enough, like to stay safe, yeah, and if something comes into their world that's dangerous, if they fight that thing, what are they risking? But what might they actually win back or earn, right? And if you ask that question every step of the way, the narrative almost writes itself. If you just keep introducing new places or new things or new adversaries or new challenges, put them in a different place, just give them a stick of gum and tell them to walk at the same time. Like give them a challenge, and just wait and see. Something will happen, you know? Something will happen. Um, and the last thing somebody told me recently was make the reader uncomfortable. Readers like being uncomfortable. They like being poked and prodded and unsettled, and uh, they like to look at things that nobody has shown them before, things that make them blush, things that make them feel like they cringe away from it, but they still look anyway. Um, you want the reader to be uncomfortable because the tension can be very productive. If they've been told well enough in the first paragraph, like Toni Morrison does, I will show you these things, right? Give them a question they can't answer, right? Give them a situation they can't solve. Give them a character who's problematic. Something inevitably, necessarily has to happen from there. And that's where the tension comes from, you know? And I can't remember the name of the craft writer. Somebody wrote 21st Century Fiction is the name of the book. His name is escaping me right now. Writing 21st Century Fiction. And he says, have tension like that on every single page. If you have a full page without tension, cut it. Your reader has to have a question or else they're not going to turn the page to find out what the answer is. So there's a lot there. And then there are other people, Mary, who just sit down and write, and I envy them. They don't have any method. I think there's something in chat. Oh, that's the doc. Yeah.
Yes, I posted your resource document.
Well, thank you. That gives me a lot to chew on for sure.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, so we've got a document that I'm sharing with you guys that has several different lists of things that you might explore if you're interested in ghost story specifically. If you open it up, you'll see um, it's not the kind of list that you would actually work your way through, but you could pick out a few things that might be curiosities to you.
Are there any other questions or comments for Grace?
I'm not hearing if anybody's.
Grace, I don't know if my audio is on or
Oh,
not.
now I can hear you. I can
Okay,
hear you
good.
now. Yeah.
Talking about poetry, I don't know if you are familiar with or have read that wonderful Robert Frost poem called "The Witch of Kuas," which is a classic, very frightening ghost story. In a poetry, you don't think of Robert Frost as writing ghost stories, but I recommend it. It's really quite good.
It's
The
like I
Witch
said,
of Coos.
COOS. I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. No, I'm not familiar with that one. No, I work in fiction so much, but not so much in poetry.
No.
I'll look into that though. Isn't it odd? Every single author you can think of probably has written some version of a ghost story or
Mhm.
some kind of a ghost poem or ghost play. They step into people's work.
Sure.
It's interesting.
What is since there are not many magazines published anymore, what's the output? Where do you send this stuff once you've written it?
Oh,
What's
in
the
the
market?
document, yeah, in the document that I sent you guys, there's a short list of journals and magazines that accept pieces that have to do with ghost stories.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's in that document. Um, you find ghost stories everywhere. It's not like it's a niche market. In the Victorian times, it was like that too. You could find ghost stories everywhere in the newspapers and magazines, novels certainly. And these days, it's the same thing. You can find it everywhere.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other thoughts? We still have about 5 minutes.
I really appreciate that the two of you came. This is my introduction to the Encore population, so it was nice to meet the two of you.
Well, can I read the first two paragraphs of something I was fooling with?
Oh, yes, please.
On one basement wall of his newly purchased home, Mortimer discovered what appeared to be a small crack. He noted it, but paid little attention until after a rainstorm, he saw the crack had widened. 2 weeks later, the foundation of his house shifted slightly, and to his dismay, the crack grew larger. What he saw appeared to be a large green hand, its fingers and thumb curled into a fist, poking from the crack. The fist seemed to grow as the wall crack widened. Frightened, Mortimer called his realtor, who in turn checked with the previous owners. Oh, so that's where my son's missing Incredible Hulk puppet hand got to. He always wondered what happened to it. Our little Willis was devastated when he lost it. It must have fallen through that open space behind his closet wall and into the basement room. Relieved by this news, Mortimer removed the Hulk's hand and reunited it with his young owner. But 2 weeks later, another small green hand appeared, stretching itself from the same wall crack. This hand had clutching, long clawed nails and gnarled fingers. It moved and climbed crab-like from the wall and fell to the basement floor, and there it scuttled to the steps leading to the room above. And it goes on like that.
Oh, you're good. You're so good. That was wonderfully creepy.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. What was your inspiration?
Some scratch in the back of my head. I don't know what it was.
That's wonderful. I love that. I love that so much. I want you to keep going with it. I want more. I hope you keep working on it.
I will. Yeah.
Keep going with that. That's fantastic. Hooray.
Okay, well, any final thoughts, Grace?
No, no, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Maybe I'll see you all again at some other time.
Good.
Yes, I learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right. Well, happy holidays to everyone. And thank you, Grace, for being here this evening. And we'll see you all soon.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah.